My name is Maeve, and I'm 61 years old. I've lived a quiet, simple life ever since my husband, Charles, passed away 6 years ago. I was a school teacher for most of my life, and I retired with modest savings and a small pension. It's enough to keep my little house running, to buy groceries, and to enjoy the occasional cup of tea by the window as the world rushes past outside. I never needed much more than that. I thought my family loved me for who I was, not what I had. But I learned that day how wrong I was, how deeply pride can poison a man's heart. My daughter, Isla, is 32. She's the joy of my life, bright, kind, and far more patient than I ever was at her age. When she met Brandon 5 years ago, I could see the charm dripping off him like honey. He was smooth, confident, and ambitious. Too ambitious, if you asked me. I tried to be happy for her, I really did. But I saw the way he carried himself, the way he talked about people as if everyone existed on a scale of usefulness and wealth. I hoped time would mellow him. Instead, it seemed to make him worse. As Brandon's business began to grow, so did his arrogance. He made sure everyone knew he was a self-made man. Drove expensive cars, wore tailored suits, and acted like my modest home was beneath him. Still, I kept my peace. For Isla's sake, I smiled through the dinner visits and polite conversations. I told myself it was just his youth, or insecurity, or maybe some twisted version of pride. That evening, Isla invited me to dinner at their house, a beautiful suburban home with white columns and a garden trimmed to perfection. I decided to wear my favorite outfit, a soft cardigan, a navy skirt, and the same brown leather shoes I'd worn for years. They were comfortable and broken in from years of walking to and from the school where I taught. They had scuffs along the edges, the soles were a little faded, but they were mine. They had walked me through grief, through long days and lonely nights. I never thought much of them until Brandon did. When I stepped inside, Isla greeted me with a warm hug, but I noticed the way Brandon's eyes flicked downward almost instantly. He didn't even try to hide his smirk. "Mom," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth, "those shoes have seen better days, haven't they?" I chuckled lightly, hoping to diffuse the moment. "They're still good enough to carry me where I need to go," I said. He grinned, shaking his head. "You know, people say your shoes tell you a lot about a person. I guess you really are practical." The pause before that last word told me everything he wanted it to mean. Isla shot him a look, her lips tightening. "Brandon," she muttered under her breath. "Stop." But he didn't. He never did. Throughout dinner, he kept finding little ways to make me feel small. When the server poured the wine, he made a comment about how I probably wasn't used to such expensive bottles. When Isla complimented the roast, he said, "Well, not everyone can afford good ingredients, right?" He even joked about my thrift store taste when I complimented their decor. I smiled through it all, nodding politely. But inside, I was burning. I could see the discomfort on Isla's face, how she wanted to say something but was torn between loyalty to her husband and love for me. I didn't want to make it harder for her, so I kept silent. After dessert, Brandon leaned back in his chair, satisfied and smug. "You know, Maeve," he said, "you really should think about taking better care of yourself. First impressions matter. If you ever need help picking something decent to wear, I could take you shopping one day." I froze. The insult was dressed up as kindness, but it hit like a slap. I looked at him and smiled. "That's very generous of you, Brandon," I said softly. "But I'm not looking to impress anyone these days." He chuckled. "Everyone, we should, at least a little. Appearance reflects financial sense, you know." I'll never forget that moment, the way his words rolled off his tongue, the quiet judgment in his tone. I felt something shift inside me then. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was anger, maybe it was something deeper, a realization that I had allowed this young man to believe he could define my worth. When I got home that night, I sat by the window, my old shoes resting by the door. The moonlight touched their worn leather, and for the first time, I looked at them not as something shabby, but as a symbol of everything I had endured. I thought about Charles, about all those years of working hard, living simply, and never needing to prove anything to anyone. But Brandon had awakened something in me. Not revenge, Exactly. Something more like resolve. I decided I wasn't going to let that smug look be the last word in how he saw me. I didn't know yet how things would unfold, or that life was about to hand me an unexpected card from the past, something that would turn Brandon's arrogance on its head. That night, I decided something had to change, though Brandon would never see it coming. 2 days later, while cleaning the attic, I stumbled upon an old wooden box my late husband had hidden away. The attic smelled like dust and memories. I hadn't been up there in years, not since Charles passed. After that dinner with Brandon, I couldn't sleep properly. His words replayed in my mind like a cruel echo. Every glance, every sneer, every dismissive smirk reminded me how small he thought I was. I needed something to distract myself, so I decided to sort through the attic, finally tackling the boxes I had left untouched since Charles's death. I told myself I'd just organize them, maybe donate a few old things. But fate had other plans. As I pulled out an old suitcase filled with lesson plans and faded photographs, I noticed something strange tucked behind a beam. A wooden box, carved with Charles's initials. I frowned. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it had been hidden intentionally. My heart started to pound. Charles wasn't a secretive man, but he did have a quiet side. I carried the box downstairs and set it on the dining table. My fingers hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, was an envelope with my name written across it in Charles's handwriting. "For Maeve, when you're ready." My throat tightened. That was his writing, steady, slanted, and unmistakable. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, folded neatly. The ink slightly faded but still legible. I took a deep breath and began to read. He started by telling me how much he loved me, how he'd always admired my patience and quiet strength. Then his words grew more serious. He wrote about an investment he had made decades ago, something he had kept private because he wasn't sure it would amount to anything. A piece of land, just outside town, that he'd purchased with his brother back when we were newly married. Over the years, his brother had passed, and Charles had quietly taken over full ownership. What stunned me most was what came next. He revealed that the land had been developed into a thriving commercial district. And all legal documents, he wrote, were under my name. He had arranged everything through a lawyer before his passing but hadn't wanted to burden me with it while I was grieving. At the bottom of the letter, there was a note. Safety Deposit Box, Main Street Bank. Box number 214. Key in my blue toolbox. I sat there in silence, reading it again and again. My husband, my quiet, thoughtful Charles, had left me something extraordinary. Not because of the money, but because of what it meant. He had trusted me with it, believed I would know what to do when the time came. I went straight to the garage, pulled out his old blue toolbox, and sure enough, nestled between rusted nails and a measuring tape, was a small brass key with the number 214 engraved on it. I stared at it for a long moment, overwhelmed by emotion. The next morning, I called the bank. I explained who I was and mentioned the deposit box. The woman on the other end confirmed its existence and said I was the registered owner. My appointment was set for that afternoon. When I arrived, the manager greeted me kindly and led me into a private room. I unlocked the small metal box, my hands shaking, and lifted the lid. Inside were several neatly arranged folders, property deeds, investment papers, and recent valuation reports. My breath caught as I read through them. The property had skyrocketed in value over the years. What had once been a modest investment was now worth several $1,000,000. Tears welled in my eyes. For years, I'd lived modestly, believing my husband had left me just enough to get by. I never knew he had secured a future far brighter than I imagined. I sat there in stunned silence, emotions swirling: grief, gratitude, disbelief. I could almost hear his voice in the back of my mind, that gentle tone he always used when I worried about money. "Maeve, one day you'll see that we did just fine." When I left the bank, the sun was low in the sky, painting the world gold. I held the papers close to my chest as though I were carrying him with me. I wasn't rich in the way Brandon valued wealth. I was rich in the kind of love and foresight that lasts beyond death. But as I drove home, something stirred inside me. I thought about Brandon's words, his laughter, the way he had looked at me like I was beneath him. He had no idea that the woman he mocked for her old shoes now owned more than he could dream of. And I didn't plan to tell him not yet. This wasn't about proving a point or seeking revenge. It was about understanding the people around me. I wanted to see who valued me when they thought I had nothing. That night, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the letter and documents spread before me. I read Charles's words one more time before carefully tucking everything back into the envelope. My husband had believed in quiet strength, and I would honor that. But soon, an opportunity would arise to test exactly that. A week later, Isla showed up at my house, pale and anxious. It was early morning, and I was in the middle of baking bread when I heard her car pull up. Isla rarely came unannounced. She's always been the type to text first, to make sure I wasn't busy or resting. So when I saw her through the kitchen window, hair tied messily, shoulders hunched, eyes tired, I knew something was wrong before she even knocked. "Mom," she said softly as I opened the door. Her voice trembled slightly. "Can I come in?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, guiding her toward the kitchen. "Sit down. What's going on?" She hesitated, twisting her fingers together. The silence between us stretched for a long moment before she finally spoke. "It's Brandon. His business is in trouble, bad trouble." My stomach tightened. "What kind of trouble?" He made some bad investments," she admitted. "Something about a partnership that fell through. He's been trying to fix it, but the debts keep piling up. We're behind on payments. The bank is threatening to seize the office." I stayed quiet, letting her speak. Her voice cracked halfway through the explanation. "He didn't want me to say anything, but I'm scared, Mom. I've never seen him like this. He barely sleeps. He's so angry all the time." I could feel the worry radiating from her like heat. My heart broke seeing my daughter like that, caught between loyalty and fear. She looked down at her hands, voice barely above a whisper. "He asked if there was any way we could borrow some money from you. Just a small loan," he said. "Enough to buy time." I studied her face. Isla was embarrassed, ashamed even. Though none of this was her fault. "Does Brandon know you're here?" I asked gently. She shook her head. "No. He'd be furious if he found out. He said he'd rather figure it out himself, but I can tell he's desperate. I thought maybe you could help us. Just this once." I took a deep breath, pretending to think it over, but inside, my mind was spinning. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just days ago, Brandon had mocked me for wearing worn-out shoes, assuming I barely scraped by. Now he was drowning in debt, and the woman he'd insulted could easily save him with a single signature. "Let me think about it," I said carefully. "I'll see what I can do." Isla nodded, relief flashing briefly in her eyes. "Thank you, Mom. I didn't want to ask, but I didn't know what else to do." She stayed for lunch, but I could tell her thoughts were elsewhere. She checked her phone constantly, probably afraid of missing a message from Brandon. Before she left, I hugged her tightly. "It's going to be okay," I whispered. "I promise." When she drove away, I stood by the window, watching her car disappear down the road. My chest felt heavy not because of the money, but because I could see how much her husband's pride was breaking her spirit. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table again, spreading my husband's papers in front of me. I had the power to help, yes, but should I? Charles had taught me that money reveals people's true nature. I had no doubt Brandon's attitude toward me would change if he discovered I was wealthy, but I didn't want to see gratitude in his eyes. I wanted to see sincerity. I spent hours thinking about it. Part of me wanted to march to their house, throw those deeds on the table, and show him who he'd been mocking. But another part of me, the wiser part, knew I needed to wait. I needed to see how far his arrogance would go before it broke him. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I wouldn't refuse Isla's request, but I wouldn't rush into anything either. I wanted to look Brandon in the eye, to hear how he spoke to me when he still thought I was the poor mother-in-law with old shoes. So I called Isla and suggested we all meet for dinner, just the three of us. I told her it would be nice to catch up, and she sounded genuinely happy about it. That evening, I stood in front of my closet, holding 2 pairs of shoes in my hands. One was a brand new pair I'd bought years ago but never worn. The other was my usual, those same scuffed, worn-out shoes that Brandon loved to mock. I smiled faintly and slipped on the old pair. They had seen me through tougher moments than this, and somehow, I knew they'd carry me through what was coming next. When I arrived at the restaurant, I spotted them at a table by the window. Isla smiled when she saw me, but Brandon's eyes immediately darted downward again to my shoes, of course. His lips curled into that same superior smirk. "Good evening, Maeve," he said smoothly. "Glad you could make it. Hope this place isn't too upscale for you." I smiled politely. "I'll manage." He laughed, clearly enjoying his own joke. Isla frowned but stayed quiet. We ordered dinner, and as the conversation unfolded, Brandon's usual charm made a reappearance. He spoke about his temporary business issues as if they were nothing, then casually shifted the topic toward family unity and how sometimes we all need to pitch in for each other. I knew where this was going. I nodded along, waiting. Finally, he said, "Maeve, you've always been such a kind woman. I was wondering if maybe you could help us out for a bit. Just a small loan to get through this rough patch. I'd pay you back, of course." I tilted my head slightly, feigning thought. "Brandon, I'm retired. I don't have much these days. I'll have to think about it." His smirk faltered for a moment before returning. "Well, that's understandable," he said, though the edge in his tone was clear. "I suppose everyone contributes in their own way." I smiled, but my heart was firm. I would not let arrogance disguise itself as entitlement. Brandon's reaction that evening revealed far more than I expected. When I walked into the restaurant, Brandon's eyes went straight to my shoes again. I had chosen that restaurant deliberately. It wasn't too fancy, but it wasn't cheap either, the kind of place where people like Brandon like to flaunt their success. I arrived a few minutes early, as I always do, and watched from the lobby as the two of them entered. Isla looked radiant even in her worry. Her beauty so effortless it almost made me ache to see her trapped beside a man like him. Brandon, as usual, wore a suit that screamed for attention, the kind that says, "I'm doing well, even if I'm not." He noticed me before Isla did. His eyes immediately flicked to my shoes, then back up to my face. I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. That smirk so familiar by now was already in place before he even spoke. "Maeve," he said smoothly, extending his hand. "You look comfortable." I smiled and shook it. "Comfort's worth more than it looks," I said, keeping my tone light. He chuckled and turned to the hostess. "Reservation for Turner," he said, with that self-satisfied tone he used when he wanted to sound important. We were led to a table by the window, candles flickering between us. Isla tried to fill the silence with small talk, asking about my garden, my neighbors, anything to avoid tension. But Brandon wasn't the type to let things stay pleasant for long. He thrived on control. When the waiter brought the menus, he ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than I used to make in a week. I ordered tea. He noticed, of course. "Tea, Maeve?" he said with mock surprise. "You really should try the wine. It's one of the best they have here." "I'm sure it is," I replied. "But tea suits me just fine." He smirked. "Suit yourself." We ate in near silence for a while. I watched him carefully, how he spoke to the waiter, how he subtly corrected Isla, how he puffed himself up with every sentence. Every action screamed insecurity disguised as arrogance. Halfway through dinner, he leaned back and folded his hands behind his head. "You know, Maeve, I've always admired people who manage their finances well," he said casually, as if we were discussing the weather. "Isla tells me you've done a great job staying afloat on your pension." I nodded. "I make do." "That's good," he said, flashing a toothy grin. "Still, it must be tough sometimes. The cost of living isn't what it used to be. I imagine saving isn't easy." Isla's face turned pale. "Brandon," she said warningly, "please." But he waved her off. "I'm just saying it's admirable, really. Though it must get tiring, counting every penny." I smiled softly. You'd be surprised what a person can manage when they value peace over possessions. He laughed, shaking his head. That's one way to look at it, but sometimes, peace costs money. I let the words hang in the air for a moment. He was setting the stage, warming me up before the real question came. I could see it in his eyes. Sure enough, as dessert arrived, he leaned forward, his tone shifting into that practiced blend of charm and pity. Maeve, he said, I'll be honest with you. Things have been a little rough for us lately, just temporary setbacks, of course. My business had some unexpected expenses. I nodded, pretending to be interested. He continued, It's nothing major, but we could use a little help to bridge the gap, just a small loan to tide us over. I know you don't have much, but anything helps. We're family, after all. I looked at him, his expression carefully, rehearsed. And I saw it, his belief that he was manipulating me. That he could tug on my guilt, make me feel obligated to rescue him. Brandon, I said gently, I wish I could help. But I really don't have that kind of money lying around. My pension covers just enough for me. He frowned, though he tried to disguise it with a chuckle. Ah, I figured as much, he said. Well, it's fine, we'll figure it out. Maybe you could sell a few of your old things? I know you must have sentimental items. The air went still. Isla looked mortified. I stared at him calmly, my heart beating steadily. I'm sure you'll find a way, I said. You always seem to. He smirked again, though this time it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I will, he said confidently. Dinner ended with polite goodbyes, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Isla hugged me tightly before they left, whispering, I'm sorry, Mom. I patted her back and told her not to worry. When I stepped outside into the cool night air, I took a long breath. The stars were scattered across the sky, the kind of quiet beauty that Brandon would never notice. I looked down at my shoes, the ones he had mocked again that night, and smiled. They had carried me through grief, through loss, through countless small humiliations. They would carry me through this too. That night, I went home, sat by my kitchen window, and poured myself another cup of tea. I thought about Charles's letter, about the fortune sitting quietly in my name. For the first time, I wasn't sad about his secrecy. I understood it. He'd given me not just financial security, but power, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. As I sipped my tea, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront Brandon outright, not yet. But I would take one quiet, deliberate step toward reclaiming my dignity. The world had a strange way of revealing the truth to those who least expected it. Little did he know I was about to make a decision that would change his entire world. The next morning, I drove to the bank holding the key to the safety deposit box my husband mentioned. The morning sun was soft and golden, cutting through the fog that hung low over the quiet streets. I hadn't slept much the night before. My mind kept replaying every smirk, every snide remark Brandon had ever thrown my way. But beneath that irritation was a different feeling, a calm sort of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I dressed neatly, slipped on my worn shoes again, and tucked the small brass key into my purse. Main Street Bank stood tall and glassy, its polished facade reflecting the morning light. It felt strange walking into such a modern building, knowing I was about to open something my husband had hidden decades ago. The woman at the reception desk smiled politely as I handed her my ID and the key. Safety deposit box 214, I said, my voice steady. Of course, Mrs. Turner, she replied, tapping at her computer. Right this way. She led me to a quiet back room where the boxes were stored behind thick steel doors. The air was cool and still, heavy with the smell of metal and paper. She unlocked the main gate, then handed me the small box once she verified my access. Take your time, she said kindly before leaving me alone. I placed the box on the table and hesitated for a moment, just staring at it. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a shoebox, but it felt impossibly heavy in my hands. My husband had trusted me with this. With a deep breath, I turned the key and lifted the lid. Inside was a neatly organized collection of documents. Property deeds, investment certificates, letters from his lawyer, and a few old photographs, one of Charles standing proudly in front of a vacant lot I didn't recognize. My breath caught as I read the first page. It confirmed everything his letter had said: the land, the ownership, the enormous appreciation in value over the years. My husband had left me something extraordinary. I spent the next hour reading every page, cross-checking the numbers, my disbelief growing with each line. The lawyer's valuation from the previous year alone placed the property's worth in the millions. I leaned back, tears welling up as I thought about all the years I'd spent worrying about small bills, counting coins at the grocery store, and feeling guilty for indulging in even the simplest pleasures. Charles had taken care of me silently, patiently, with the same quiet love that had always defined him. When I left the vault room, I met with one of the bank's advisors to discuss the assets. He confirmed that everything was still active and entirely in my name. "Mrs. Turner," he said with a smile, "you're in a very strong financial position. If you'd like, we can connect you with an attorney to help manage the estate and update your legal documents." I nodded. Yes, I think that would be wise. He gave me the name of a lawyer, Mr. Langston, one of the most reputable estate attorneys in the city, and helped me schedule an appointment for Monday morning. When I walked out of that bank, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, pride, and something I hadn't felt in a long time: power. Not the loud, showy kind Brandon worshipped, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from knowing you're in control of your life. I stopped by a cafe on the way home and sat by the window, sipping coffee and thinking. For years, I'd been the quiet widow, the woman who wore the same shoes and carried the same handbag, unnoticed and underestimated. Brandon had laughed at me, mocked me, looked through me, and yet, I held more than he could ever imagine. I smiled faintly at the thought, not out of malice but from a sense of poetic justice. There was something beautifully ironic about it all. When I got home, I called Isla to check on her. She sounded tired, her voice heavy with stress. "Brandon's been working non-stop," she said. "He's trying to find investors, but no one's biting. I don't know what's going to happen." "Have faith, sweetheart," I said softly. "Things have a way of working out." After I hung up, I sat at my desk and reviewed the bank documents again. I decided that I wouldn't tell Isla about this just yet, not until I was sure how to handle Brandon. I didn't want to put her in the middle of what was coming. Later that evening, I went through Charles's letter again. This time reading every word slowly. His handwriting felt alive. His presence almost tangible through the ink. At the bottom of the page, he had written something I'd missed before. "Remember, Maeve worth is not measured by what you show the world, but by what you carry inside you." That sentence echoed in my mind all night. Brandon thought wealth was about status, about showing off to others. But Charles had understood something deeper: that true wealth was quiet confidence, dignity, and love. I decided right then how I would handle my newfound fortune. I wouldn't flaunt it. I wouldn't confront Brandon with it. I would let him reveal his character completely, let him write his own downfall without even knowing it. As I placed the letter back into its box, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. The same woman, the same clothes, the same old shoes, but something inside me had changed. I no longer felt small. I no longer felt looked down upon. I was no longer playing by his rules. Brandon's judgmental eyes would soon see me in a place he never expected. Meanwhile, Brandon's behavior toward me grew worse. The following week, I noticed a shift in how Brandon treated me. It wasn't enough for him to quietly judge anymore. His arrogance was starting to spill into open mockery. Every interaction seemed to be an opportunity for him to assert his superiority. It was subtle at first, but soon, it became hard to ignore. At Sunday lunch, which Isla insisted we all share together, he made jokes that barely hid their cruelty. When I brought over a homemade casserole, he laughed, saying, "Still cooking old school, huh? You should try one of those meal delivery kits. They save you time and embarrassment." He winked as though it were harmless teasing. But Isla's jaw tightened. I smiled and served myself a small portion. "I suppose I like doing things the old way," I said simply. He shrugged. "Sure, if that works for you. I just think presentation matters, you know. Especially for family gatherings. You never know who might drop by." "True," I said, nodding. Though the people worth having around usually don't judge by presentation. That silenced him for a moment, though not for long. He wasn't the type to let a remark like that slide. I could see the irritation flash behind his polished exterior. Later that afternoon, while Isla was cleaning up, Brandon offered to help me take some boxes to my car. We stepped outside, and as soon as we were alone, he leaned against the porch railing with that smirk of his. "You know," he began casually, "I don't mean to sound rude, but I think it's time you let Isla and me help you out. Maybe I can take a look at your finances, make sure you're managing things properly. I'm good with money after all." The irony almost made me laugh. I kept my expression calm. "That's kind of you to offer, Brandon, but I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs." He grinned, his tone dropping slightly. "Of course you are. I just worry, you know? You're not getting any younger. I'd hate to see you waste what little you have on, well, things that don't hold value." I looked him straight in the eye. "Thank you for your concern," I said evenly. "But I've managed just fine so far." He gave a short laugh, clearly not expecting resistance. "Fair enough, I guess you like keeping things simple." "Simple?" I echoed, my voice soft but steady. "Yes. I suppose that's one way to describe it." That evening, as I drove home, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Every word he spoke, every insult wrapped in false concern, it all confirmed that I was right not to tell him the truth. A man like Brandon didn't value kindness or humility. He valued control, and when he thought he held it, he became cruel. The irony of the situation grew even sharper when Isla called later that night. "Brandon's been meeting with a bankruptcy lawyer," she confessed quietly. "He hasn't told anyone, but I found some papers in his briefcase. He's trying to negotiate with his creditors." I listened without interrupting. "Does he know you know?" I asked. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to bring it up. He's so proud he'd rather sink than admit failure." Her words echoed in my mind long after we hung up. Pride before the fall. It was one of Charles's favorite sayings. I had a feeling Brandon was about to learn that lesson firsthand. A few days later, fate decided to intervene. I received a call from Mr. Langston's office, confirming my appointment for Monday morning. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. That same evening, Isla called again to tell me Brandon would also be meeting his lawyer on Monday at the same law firm. Different departments, of course, but the same building. When she mentioned the address, I almost laughed out loud. "Really?" I said, trying to sound surprised. "That's quite a coincidence." She sighed. "He's dreading it. He hates asking for help, even from professionals. He's convinced he can talk his way out of anything." I smiled to myself, though she couldn't see it. "Well, maybe it'll be a productive day for both of us," I said lightly. That night, I laid out my clothes for the meeting, my best blouse, a neat skirt, and of course, my old shoes. The same ones Brandon had mocked. They had become almost symbolic by now, a quiet statement of who I was and what I stood for. When Monday morning came, I woke early, made myself a cup of coffee, and drove into the city. The sky was bright, the air crisp, and I felt oddly at peace. There was no nervousness, no resentment, just quiet resolve. When I arrived at the building, I took a deep breath before stepping inside. The lobby was sleek and modern, the kind of place that screamed wealth and power. As I waited by the elevator, I glanced at the glass directory board on the wall. There it was, Langston and Associates. I smiled faintly. Everything was in motion now. Though Brandon didn't have the faintest idea. He would be there soon, walking into the same building with the same smug confidence, thinking he was the only one who belonged there. That coincidence would soon destroy the illusion Brandon built around himself. The moment I stepped into the law office lobby, I saw Brandon pacing outside a conference room. The marble floors gleamed under the soft light, and the quiet hum of conversation echoed faintly from the nearby offices. I had arrived 15 minutes early for my appointment with Mr. Langston, hoping to review a few details with his assistant. But the last person I expected to see standing there, tapping his polished shoes impatiently against the floor, was my son-in-law. Brandon looked every bit the image he tried so hard to project: tailored suit, gold watch, a phone glued to his hand. Yet there was something different about him that morning. His posture was tighter, his jaw more tense. For the first time, I could see cracks forming beneath his carefully crafted confidence. He noticed me almost immediately. His eyes flicked up, then down straight to my shoes. The familiar smirk spread across his face like clockwork. Well, he said, pocketing his phone. Didn't expect to see you here, Maeve. Paying bills or taking out a loan? I smiled. Politely. Neither, actually. I'm here to meet with my lawyer. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried more arrogance than humor. Your lawyer? What for? Don't tell me you're suing the grocery store for overcharging on coupons. I met his eyes, unflinching. Something like that, I said lightly. Before he could say anything else, a young receptionist stepped out of one of the offices. Mrs. Maeve Turner? She asked, looking around the lobby. I raised my hand slightly. That's me. She smiled warmly. Mr. Langston is ready for you, right this way. As I followed her past Brandon, I didn't need to turn around to feel his confusion. I could almost hear the disbelief in the silence that followed me. For a man like Brandon, seeing someone he deemed beneath him being treated with respect was almost incomprehensible. We walked down a glass-walled corridor lined with modern art and entered a spacious office overlooking the city. Mr. Langston, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and a calm demeanor, stood to greet me. Mrs. Turner, he said warmly, shaking my hand. It's a pleasure to meet you. I've reviewed your documents. Your husband did an excellent job setting things up. You're in a very strong position. Thank you, I said, taking a seat. He always was meticulous. He smiled. Yes, I can see that. Now, about the property. As he spoke, he laid out several folders and maps on the table documents, with my name printed in bold letters at the top. From where I sat, I could see through the glass walls into the hallway. And there, as if fate had scripted it, stood Brandon. He had just stepped out of the conference room across the hall, likely waiting for his lawyer, but instead of focusing on his own troubles, his attention was glued to me. His face was a mixture of confusion and disbelief, as he watched Mr. Langston hand me papers, shake my hand, and address me with professional respect. When Mr. Langston mentioned figures numbers with 6 and 7 digits attached to my name, I saw Brandon's jaw drop through the reflection in the glass. I almost pitied him. Almost. I stayed calm, my voice steady as I signed the necessary papers. We discussed transferring a portion of the assets into a trust and updating the legal title of the property. Mr. Langston congratulated me on the value of the estate, saying it was one of the most stable holdings in the region. When the meeting ended, he escorted me back toward the lobby. If you need assistance managing investments or taxes, he said kindly, my team can arrange everything for you. I'll keep that in mind, I replied. As we approached the hallway, Brandon was still standing there, pretending to check his phone but failing miserably to hide his shock. I caught his eye and gave him a polite smile. Good morning again, I said pleasantly. He blinked, clearly scrambling for words. So, you're meeting with Langston? The Langston? That's right, I said simply. He's been very helpful. He swallowed hard, his usual confidence gone. I didn't realize you, needed legal help for investments. Estate management, actually, I corrected gently. My husband left me a few assets to sort through. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. To him, I had always been the poor widow with worn shoes and a modest pension. The idea that I could afford one of the city's top attorneys didn't fit his narrative. I didn't linger. I thanked Mr. Langston again and walked toward the elevator. As the doors began to close, I glanced back at Brandon one last time. He was still standing there, his expression frozen in a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization. When the elevator doors shut, I finally exhaled. I hadn't planned that encounter, but it couldn't have. It'd been more perfect if I had. For years, Brandon had measured worth by money and appearance. He believed kindness was weakness, and humility was poverty. But in that brief moment, seeing me in that office, watching my lawyer treat me as an equal, his entire illusion of superiority cracked. As I stepped out of the building, I felt lighter. The city air was cool, the sun bright on my face. My husband's foresight had given me more than security, it had given me the quiet power to stand tall, even in the eyes of those who once looked down on me. The realization on his face was priceless. When my meeting ended, Brandon was waiting, pale and visibly shaken. He was standing right outside the building, leaning against the stone railing with his phone in hand, but not really looking at it. When he saw me step through the glass doors, he straightened up quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The arrogance he usually carried had slipped, what was left was unease. "Maeve," he said, adjusting his tie. "Funny seeing you here again. So, you're working with Langston now?" His tone was careful, too casual to be genuine. I could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes, trying to fit this new piece of information into the picture he'd built of me. "Yes," I said simply. "He's helping me sort out some things my late husband left behind." He blinked, his mouth tightening. "Oh, really? I didn't know Charles had anything like that." I smiled faintly. There were a few things he didn't talk much about. He was always modest that way. Brandon chuckled awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, modest. That's good. So, what exactly was he working on?" I tilted my head. "Investments. Real estate. It's all under my name now." For a long moment, he didn't speak. His face went slack, then quickly rearranged itself into something that was supposed to look impressed. "That's incredible, Maeve. Wow. I mean, I had no idea you were into real estate." "I wasn't," I said. "But Charles was. He left it all to me." There was a silence between us. I could feel him struggling to decide how to respond. Should he feign excitement? Stay neutral? Try to dig deeper? His pride didn't know which direction to take. Finally, he forced a smile. "Well, that's great news. I'm really happy for you." I looked him in the eye. "Are you?" He swallowed, nodding quickly. "Of course. I mean, it must be a relief, right? Having that kind of security? Especially at your age." "At your age." The condescension slipped out before he could stop it. And I saw the flicker of panic cross his face when he realized it. I smiled politely, pretending not to notice. "Yes, it's a comfort to know Charles thought ahead." He laughed weakly, trying to recover. "Yeah, smart man. Always liked him." That was a lie. I remembered how Brandon had dismissed Charles as old-fashioned when he was alive, too quiet, too cautious, too content with simplicity, but I said nothing. I didn't need to defend my husband's memory to someone who valued image over integrity. As I turned to leave, Brandon followed me down the steps. "Listen," he said, his voice lowering. "I hope you don't think I've ever been disrespectful. I might joke around sometimes, but I've always admired how, grounded you are." I stopped and looked at him. "Thank you, Brandon. I appreciate that." The truth was, I could see the panic beneath the politeness. His confidence was slipping, and now that he knew I had something he didn't, money, power, and composure, he was scrambling to reframe the dynamic. Later that evening, Isla called me. Her tone was unusually cautious. "Mom," she said, "Brandon told me he ran into you today." "At the lawyer's office," I smiled to myself. "Yes, we happen to have appointments in the same building." She hesitated. "He said you were working with a pretty high-profile attorney. Is that true?" "It is," I replied. "I had some property issues to settle, nothing dramatic." "Mom?" Isla's voice softened. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I paused, considering my words carefully. "Your father left me some investments," I said finally. "It's all in order now. That's really all there is to it." She was silent for a few seconds before whispering, "I'm so glad. You deserve that." I could hear the emotion in her voice, the quiet relief. But then she added, "Brandon seemed surprised. Actually, he seemed kind of shaken." I chuckled softly. "He'll be fine. He's just not used to being wrong about people. There was a long pause, then Isla laughed, a genuine, soft laugh I hadn't heard in months. I think you rattled him, Mom. Maybe, I said, smiling. But he needed it. That night, I sat in my living room, the documents neatly filed in my desk drawer. I thought about Brandon's face when he saw me in that office, the confusion, the disbelief, the way he struggled to reconcile the image he'd built of me with the reality he'd just witnessed. For so long, he'd believed wealth made him superior, that people like me were beneath him. But in a single afternoon, the truth had flipped his entire world upside down. And while part of me felt satisfaction, another part felt something more complex, a kind of sorrow. Because I knew what pride could do to a man. It could twist him, blind him, and eventually destroy him. Still, I didn't reach out to fix it. I had done my part. The truth was out, and what came next would be entirely his choice. But deep down, I knew Brandon wasn't the type to let things go. His pride wouldn't allow it. But Brandon wasn't done trying to manipulate the situation. That evening, Brandon called me out of the blue, pretending to apologize. I was washing the dishes when my phone rang. The moment I saw his name flash on the screen, I hesitated. Brandon rarely called me directly, he usually spoke through Isla, if at all. I wiped my hands, took a slow breath, and answered. Maeve. He began quickly. His voice unusually soft. Almost too smooth. I just wanted to say, I owe you an apology. For what, Brandon? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He gave a small laugh, the kind people use to mask discomfort. You know, for how I've behaved. I've been under a lot of stress lately, and I guess I've taken it out on you. That wasn't fair. I've been disrespectful. It was strange hearing those words from him. But even through the apology, something in his voice didn't sound genuine. It was measured, deliberate, like a salesman rehearsing a pitch. I appreciate that, I said simply. He hesitated, then sighed, as though forcing himself to sound sincere. I mean it. You've always been kind to Isla and me, and I feel terrible for making jokes that weren't funny. You didn't deserve that. That's thoughtful of you to say, I replied. Thank you. There was a pause, then his tone shifted, ever so slightly. I couldn't help but notice how well you're doing. The lawyer, the property. That's amazing, really. I had no idea Charles left you something like that. Ah, there it was. The real reason for the call. Yes, I said evenly. It was quite a surprise to me, too. He cleared his throat. You know, I have a background in business and investments. Maybe I could help you manage some of that? Make sure everything's safe and profitable. I mean, lawyers are fine, but they charge so much for what they do. I could save you a lot of money, I smiled, though he couldn't see it. That's generous of you, Brandon, but Mr. Langston and his team are handling things perfectly. His voice tightened. Oh, well, sure, but lawyers don't understand real markets like I do. I mean, this could be a great opportunity for both of us. For both of us? I repeated. He laughed nervously. You know, I could manage some of the assets for you. Help grow them. Maybe even use part of the funds as collateral to restart my business. We'd both benefit, family helping family. I let his words hang in the air. I see, I said slowly. You'd like to use my inheritance to fix your company's problems. He fell silent for a moment, realizing I'd stripped his offer of its polite wrapping. No, not like that, he said quickly. It'd be an investment. You'd get a return, of course. I'm sure I would, I replied calmly. But I'm not interested, Brandon. There was a long pause. Then, his voice hardened, just a little. You're serious? You're just going to sit on it? Let it gather dust? It's not gathering dust, I said quietly. It's doing exactly what it needs to, providing security. He gave a low, humorless laugh. Security. You know, some people might say you're being selfish. Holding on to all that when your own daughter's struggling. I froze, not because his words hurt, they didn't, but because they revealed his true character once and for all. He wasn't calling out of remorse. He was calling out of desperation, trying to weaponize guilt the way manipulators do when their charm fails. My daughter isn't struggling, Brandon, I said firmly. She's married to someone who made choices. Choices come with consequences. Wow, he said, his tone turning sharp. So that's how it is, huh? You're just going to watch while everything falls apart? I'm watching to see what you learn from it, I replied softly. There was silence on the other end, followed by a frustrated exhale. You're something else, Maeve, he said bitterly. I guess I misjudged you. Yes, I said. You did. Then I hung up. For several minutes, I stood in my kitchen, staring at the darkened window, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. My hands were steady, my heart didn't race. There was no guilt, no second-guessing, just calm. When Isla called later that night, I didn't mention the conversation, but I could hear the weariness in her voice. He's been on edge all day, she said quietly. He won't tell me why. I didn't have to guess. Isla, I said softly. You need to start thinking about what you want. Not what he wants. Not what he promises what you deserve. She didn't answer right away. Do you think he'll change? I sighed. People change when they lose everything they use to control others. Sometimes that's the only way. She was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, I think I already know what I need to do. That night, as I prepared for bed, I realized Brandon's call had been the final confirmation I needed. The mask had slipped completely. Beneath the charm and confidence, there was only fear of losing power, of facing himself without wealth to hide behind. I knew he'd lash out before accepting defeat. People like him always did. But the fallout from his pride was only beginning. Isla finally confronted Brandon about his cruelty and greed. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when she showed up at my door, drenched and trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of a decision she'd finally made. I had just set a pot of soup on the stove when I saw her standing there. Her eyes were red, her mascara streaked. I didn't need to ask what had happened. Come in, I said softly, stepping aside. She walked past me, shoulders shaking. I can't do it anymore, Mom, she said as soon as the door closed behind her. I just can't. I led her to the kitchen, wrapped a blanket around her, and waited for her to catch her breath. For a moment, the only sound was the rain tapping against the round windows. Then it all came pouring out, words, tears, frustration she'd been holding back for far too long. He's not the same man I married, she said between sobs. He's angry all the time. He blames me for everything, for his business failing, for the bills, for his own bad choices. He says I should have convinced you to give him money. I froze, though I wasn't surprised. He told you that? She nodded. He said you were being selfish. That you're just sitting on money you don't even need. I told him he was out of line. And he yelled at me. He said I didn't understand loyalty, that family is supposed to help family. I took her hands in mine. Sweetheart, helping someone doesn't mean feeding their pride. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with confusion and pain. I thought I could fix him, Mom. I really did. I thought if I supported him enough, if I stayed patient, he'd change. You can't fix a man who doesn't think he's broken, I said gently. She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. He's been lying to me too. About money, about meetings, about what he's been doing. I found out he's been trying to get investors by using your name, Mom. He told people he had connections through you, that you were funding him. I didn't even know until one of his business partners called asking for you. My stomach turned. That wasn't just desperate, that was deceitful. What did you tell them? I asked quietly. The truth, she said firmly. That you're not involved in any of it, that he's on his own. For a long moment, we sat in silence. The rain outside grew heavier, the sky darkening. I could feel the storm both inside and out. Finally, Isla took a deep breath. Mom, I think I need to leave him. Her voice cracked on the last word. But there was no hesitation. Just quiet certainty. I can't keep living like this. I'm tired of being blamed, manipulated, and used. I don't even recognize myself anymore. And when I saw how he talked to you, how he tried to twist things, it made me realize how blind I've been. I reached out and pulled her into a hug. You're not blind, Isla. You're just kind. And he took advantage of that kindness. She cried into my shoulder for a long time. I held her, stroking her hair, letting her release everything she'd been carrying for years. After a while, she pulled away, her voice steadier. He doesn't love me anymore, Mom. Not really. He loves control. He loves being right. He loves feeling superior. You're right, I said softly. But you don't have to live under that anymore. She nodded slowly. I've already packed a bag. I didn't know where else to go. You're home, I said. For as long as you need. That night, she stayed in her old room. I could hear her crying quietly through the walls, the sound of a woman grieving not just a marriage, but the illusion of one. I sat by my window long after midnight, staring out at the rain and thinking of Charles. He would have been proud of her courage, even if it came with heartbreak. The next morning, Isla joined me for breakfast. Her eyes were swollen but determined. I'm going to talk to him today, she said. I need closure. I need to tell him it's over. Do you want me to come with you? I asked. She shook her head. No. I need to do it myself. So she went, and I waited. Hours passed before she returned. When she finally did, her face was pale but calm. It's done, she said quietly. He didn't take it well. He begged at first, then got angry when I didn't give in. He called me ungrateful, said I was ruining his life. What did you say? I asked. I told him he already did that himself. I saw the faintest flicker of strength in her eyes, painful, but powerful. The kind of strength that only comes after choosing self-respect over comfort. We sat together in silence, sipping tea as the last of the rain faded. And she made a decision that would redefine both our futures. 2 weeks later, Isla filed for divorce. The day she told me, she wasn't trembling or crying anymore. Her voice was clear, her shoulders steady. I could see it in her eyes. She had finally accepted what had to be done. The timid uncertainty that Brandon had cultivated in her for years was gone. What stood before me was my daughter as she was meant to be. Strong, brave, and finally free. We sat together at the kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the curtains. The stack of papers lay between us: divorce filings, financial disclosures, and a petition her lawyer had prepared. It's official, she said, exhaling. I signed everything this morning. I reached across and squeezed her hand. You did the right thing, sweetheart. I know, she whispered. But it still hurts. Of course it did. Walking away from someone you once loved, even when you know it's right, is its own kind of grief. But this time, her pain had purpose. Later that week, the proceedings began. Brandon reacted exactly how I expected: poorly. The man who had once laughed at my old shoes now found himself scrambling, desperate to salvage what he could. He showed up to the first hearing with his usual arrogance, still trying to play the part of the confident husband wronged by circumstance. Isla's lawyer, a calm, sharp woman named Diane, dismantled his facade piece by piece. Every financial record he had forgotten to disclose, every hidden debt, every questionable transfer came to light. Brandon had tried to juggle his lies, but they collapsed the moment real scrutiny touched them. I sat in the back of the courtroom, quiet but watchful. Brandon didn't look at me, but I could feel his resentment radiating across the room. To him, I was part of the reason his empire had crumbled. Maybe he even blamed me for Isla finding her. Courage. But the truth was, his downfall had started long before I'd ever said a word. At one point, his lawyer tried to argue that Isla's family connections implied access to substantial wealth, suggesting the court consider it when dividing assets. I felt the room's attention shift briefly toward me. I kept my face serene. My lawyer, who had attended for separate estate reasons, stood and clarified. Mrs. Turner's assets are solely her own, pre-existing and legally independent. They have no bearing on this case. Brandon's jaw tightened, his plan unraveling before his eyes. He had assumed he could leverage my inheritance to lessen his losses, but the law and Charles's meticulous planning made that impossible. When the judge announced that Isla would receive full ownership of their home and the little savings left in their joint account, Brandon's composure finally cracked. "This isn't fair," he snapped. "She's taking everything." The judge looked at him sternly. "From where I'm sitting, Mr. Carver, you've already taken more than enough." The gavel struck, and the hearing ended. Isla turned to me as we left, her eyes glassy but relieved. "It's over," she whispered. Outside the courthouse, we stood under a wide oak tree. The breeze carried away the last remnants of tension from the courtroom. "I thought I'd feel broken," she said. "But I don't. I feel lighter." I smiled. "That's what happens when you stop carrying someone else's weight." Brandon tried to contact her several times in the following days, calls, messages, even flowers on the porch, but she didn't respond. She'd already signed the papers. She was done. And as for him, his life began to crumble faster than even he could spin it. His company was already halfway through bankruptcy proceedings. Investors pulled out. Word of his deceit spread through his professional circles. The man who once mocked me for living modestly now had to sell his car just to cover legal fees. One afternoon, I saw him across town outside a coffee shop. He looked thinner, older. He didn't see me, and I didn't call out. For the first time, I felt no anger, no satisfaction, just quiet pity. He'd built his life on pride, and pride had eaten him alive. When I returned home that evening, Isla was sitting on the porch, sipping tea and staring at the horizon. "Do you think people like him ever change?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. "Only when they lose everything they think defines them," I said softly. "But even then, not all of them learn." She nodded, watching the fading sun paint the sky in shades of gold. There was peace in her expression now, the kind that comes only after choosing yourself over the person who tried to break you. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace too. Not because Brandon had been defeated, but because Isla had rediscovered her strength. My husband's wisdom, his foresight, had guided me to protect myself, and in doing so, I had protected her too. But there was still one more chapter to close. With Brandon gone, our lives slowly regained warmth. The silence that followed his departure wasn't empty, it was healing. For the first time in years, my home felt like a refuge again. Isla moved in with me temporarily. And together, we began to rebuild not just her life, but the quiet rhythm of peace that we had both lost. Mornings became gentle again. We'd share breakfast by the window, sipping coffee and watching the world wake up. Sometimes we talked about the past, sometimes we didn't talk at all. There was comfort in the simplicity, in the unspoken understanding that we'd both survived something heavy. I watched her change day by day. She laughed more often, smiled more easily. She began volunteering at a local shelter, helping single mothers find resources and support. "I want to help women who feel trapped like I did," she told me one morning. "Maybe if someone had said the right words to me earlier, I wouldn't have wasted so much time." I smiled proudly. "Then be that person for someone else." Meanwhile, I began to rediscover parts of myself I had neglected for too long. I hired a contractor to fix up the house, the roof, the kitchen, the squeaky floorboards that had annoyed me for years. I didn't do it to show off my newfound wealth. I did it because I finally understood that comfort and self-respect are not luxuries, they're necessities. With each repaired corner, each freshly painted wall, I felt Charles's presence lingering beside me. His careful planning had given me this second chance not to flaunt, but to live. A few months passed, and the seasons changed. One afternoon, Isla and I sat on the porch, the sun dipping low beyond the trees. I wore a new pair of shoes that day, simple but elegant, soft leather that fit perfectly. Isla noticed and smiled. "New shoes, Mom?" I chuckled. "Yes. They were on sale. But I liked them." "What happened to the old ones?" she asked gently. I glanced toward the shoe rack near the door, where they sat neatly polished. "Still here," I said. "They remind me where I came from, what I've walked through." She nodded, understanding without another word. Life moved quietly but meaningfully. The neighbors started inviting us to dinners again, and I found myself accepting. I had spent too many years shrinking my world into a small, lonely bubble of routine. Now, I wanted to see the world again on my own terms. I even started traveling, nothing extravagant. Just the kind of trips Charles and I had always dreamed of but never managed to take. A few days in the countryside, a visit to an art museum, a train ride to the coast. Each experience felt like a promise I was finally keeping to both of us. At home, Isla was thriving. Her work at the nonprofit grew into a full-time position. She began organizing workshops for women starting over after toxic marriages, teaching them about financial independence and emotional healing. Seeing her stand before those women, confident and strong, filled me with a pride I can't quite describe. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, she looked at me with that soft, reflective smile. "You know," she said, "everything that happened, it broke me for a while. But if it hadn't, I wouldn't have learned what real strength looks like." "You were always strong," I said, stirring the soup. "You just needed to remember it." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You taught me that. You showed me that strength isn't about money or power. It's about knowing who you are when everything else is stripped away." I felt tears prick at my eyes. "Your father used to say that too." We sat down to eat, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. The house was warm, peaceful, and full of laughter. After dinner, I walked out onto the porch with a cup of tea and looked up at the stars. The night was quiet, the air cool and sweet. It was strange how peace felt heavier than chaos at first, like a new skin that took time to settle into. But now, it felt natural. I thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the discovery, the quiet revenge of simply standing tall. I hadn't sought to destroy Brandon. I'd only wanted to reclaim my dignity. And in the end, that had been enough. As I stood there, a car passed slowly down the street, the headlights briefly illuminating my mailbox. Inside it, I noticed a small envelope that hadn't been there earlier. I frowned, stepping closer. It had no return address, just my name written in familiar handwriting. I picked it up, my heart skipping a beat. And then, one unexpected message arrived. Months later, Brandon sent a long letter. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address, the handwriting slightly uneven, his handwriting, but shakier than I remembered. I found it in the mailbox one crisp autumn morning, tucked between bills and a postcard from one of Isla's friends. I stood there on the porch for a long moment, the world quiet except for the wind rustling through the trees. Part of me wanted to toss it straight into the bin. But curiosity and something deeper, maybe compassion, made me open it. Inside was a few folded pages of lined paper, written in blue ink. I sat down on the porch steps and began to read. "Maeve," the letter began, "I don't know where else to start but with the truth. You were right about me. About everything." He went on for several paragraphs, confessing things I'd already known, and things I hadn't. He admitted to manipulating Isla, to lying about his finances, to using people's trust as a weapon. He even acknowledged how he had mocked me out of insecurity, how seeing me walk into that lawyer's office had been a shock to his system. "When I saw you there," he wrote, "I realized how small I am. You didn't have to say anything. Just seeing the way the lawyer respected you, it broke something in me. I thought money made me powerful, but you had something I never will. Dignity." The words blurred a little as I read on. He wrote about how everything had fallen apart, how the bankruptcy had finalized, how the house had been sold, how most of his so-called friends had disappeared once the money ran out. "I had to move into a small apartment outside town," he wrote. "I've been working odd jobs, trying to make sense of who I am without all the noise. It's humiliating, but maybe that's what I needed." He admitted that he had lost Isla for good and that he didn't blame her. "She deserved better," he wrote. "You both did. I wish I could take back the things I said to you, the way I looked down on you. I see now that I wasn't mocking your shoes or your life. I was mocking my own emptiness." My eyes filled as I reached the final page. I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote, "and I don't deserve it. I just wanted to say thank you for not stooping to my level. You could have humiliated me when you had the chance, but you didn't. You let me see the truth for myself, and that's the kind of lesson that doesn't fade." The last line read, "If you ever think of me, I hope it's not with anger, but with pity for the fool I used to be." I folded the letter carefully and sat there for a long time, letting the weight of his words sink in. It wasn't absolution, it wasn't redemption. But it was acknowledgement, and that, in its own way, mattered. That evening, I showed the letter to Isla. She read it silently, her eyes scanning each line. When she finished, she didn't speak right away. Finally, she said softly, "Do you believe him?" I thought about that. "I think he means it." In this moment, I said, "People can change, but only if they face themselves honestly. Maybe losing everything gave him that chance." She nodded slowly. "Are you going to respond?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Not for him, for me." That night, I sat at my desk and pulled out a piece of stationery. My reply was short. "Brandon, I received your letter. I forgive you. Not because what you did was excusable, but because I refuse to carry bitterness any longer. I hope you find peace in learning who you are without the lies. Maeve." I sealed the envelope and dropped it in the mailbox the next morning. As I watched the postal truck carry it away, I felt something I hadn't expected: closure. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it stops the past from owning you. I didn't forgive him to heal him. I forgave him to release myself. When I told Isla, she smiled faintly. "You always take the high road, Mom." I shrugged. "It's the only road that leads anywhere worth going." We never heard from him again after that. No more letters, no calls, no chance encounters in town. He vanished into the quiet, and I let him stay there. But as I mailed the letter, I knew this story wasn't about him anymore. Standing in front of the mirror one morning, I saw not the widow Brandon once mocked, but a woman who had reclaimed her dignity. It had been nearly a year since everything unraveled, since the sneers, the lies, the courtroom, and the letter that closed it all. Life had returned to a gentle rhythm again, one that felt genuine. I no longer woke up with the heaviness of what had been. Instead, I woke up with gratitude for what still was. When I looked at myself that morning, I didn't see the tired woman who used to hide behind modest clothes and soft smiles. My reflection held quiet strength. My hair had silvered more since Charles passed, but I wore it proudly. The lines around my eyes told stories not of age, but of endurance. My old shoes sat neatly by the door, beside a pair of new ones, simple, black leather, polished to a soft shine. I smiled at the contrast. One pair carried me through years of loss and judgment. The other carried me into a new chapter. Both had their place in my story. Downstairs, Isla was getting ready for work. She looked so much like Charles in that moment, steady, kind, and sure of herself. Her nonprofit had grown faster than she imagined. The women she helped looked up to her, not because she had survived heartbreak, but because she had transformed it into purpose. "I'll be home late," she said as she grabbed her bag. "We're hosting a support event tonight. One of the women wants to share her story." I nodded proudly. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You're doing exactly what you were meant to do." She smiled, leaning down to kiss my cheek. "You're the reason I can." After she left, the house was quiet again, peaceful, but alive with memory. I poured myself a cup of tea and walked out to the garden. The roses I'd planted the spring after Charles died were blooming again, their scent drifting through the air. I thought about how much had changed since then. There was a time I felt invisible. The widow who was pitied, the mother who was tolerated, the woman who was mocked for her simplicity. But all along, I had carried something no one could see: self-respect, and the quiet strength that comes from surviving with grace. People often mistake humility for weakness. Brandon certainly had. He thought silence meant submission, and modesty meant lack of worth. But silence can be powerful, and modesty can hide immense strength. I had learned that lesson the hard way, and in learning it, I had become someone stronger than I ever thought I could be. I walked to the small bench under the oak tree, where Charles and I used to sit on warm evenings. The wind stirred gently through the leaves, and for a moment, I could almost feel his presence beside me. "I did it, love," I whispered softly. "I found peace." In my heart, I knew he would be proud, not because of the money or the revenge, but because I had kept my integrity intact. He had always believed that true character isn't proven when life is easy, it's proven when you're underestimated and still choose kindness. I stayed there for a while, lost in thought. Eventually, I stood, dusted off my hands, and decided to visit him. The cemetery was quiet, the grass trimmed neatly, the air cool and clear. I walked slowly down the familiar path, holding a small bouquet of white lilies. When I reached his headstone, I knelt and placed them carefully beside his name. Charles Turner. It read. Beloved husband and father, a man of quiet strength. I smiled through the sting of tears. You'd laugh if you knew how much your planning changed everything, I said softly. You always told me the truth would find its way. You were right. I told him about Isla, about her work, her courage, her healing. I told him about Brandon's letter, and how forgiveness had finally freed us both. And then I thanked him, not just for the security he left behind, but for the faith he had in me to handle it wisely. As I stood, I looked down at my shoes, the same ones I'd worn to the lawyer's office that day. They were still in good shape, polished and sturdy. I realized then that I didn't need to throw them away. They were more than leather and stitching, they were symbols of endurance. The sky above was painted in soft shades of gold and pink. The world felt wide and full again, no longer small or shadowed by someone else's disdain. I walked away slowly, the gravel crunching under my feet. For the first time, every step felt light. Because this story, my story, wasn't about revenge or wealth. It was about reclaiming worth. About walking through humiliation and emerging stronger without ever losing grace. When I reached the gate, I turned back one last time, smiling. And as I walked away from that grave, my old shoes carried me proudly into a new beginning.